There is a kind of poverty that has nothing to do with money. It is the poverty of watching your own name become someone else's fortune. In 1911, a champion race car driver agreed to put his name on a car company. 3 decades later, that company was outselling every automaker in American history, while he worked, unrecognized, on its assembly line. This is not simply a story about misfortune. It is a story about strategic misalignment. What happens when two founders want the same brand to mean two entirely different things? So what actually pulled Louis Chevrolet and his partner apart? Pride, or something more structural? What does it really cost a founder to sell the rights to his own name? And is there a version of this story where a Chevrolet still sits at the boardroom table today? Keep that last question in mind. We will come back to it. Louis Chevrolet was born into a Swiss watchmaking family that crossed into France chasing work, and often went without meals along the way. He left school at 11, learned to repair bicycles, and by 16 had designed one of his own, fast enough to win local races and help feed his family. A repair job on a wealthy American's imported tricycle introduced him to the automobile, and to the idea of crossing the Atlantic. In New York, then Paris, then New York again, Louis absorbed the mechanics of internal combustion engines while chasing factory work. By 1905, driving for Fiat's American racing team, he broke a 1-mile speed record and became a minor celebrity, a large, mustached daredevil the newspapers loved. That fame was about to be worth more to someone else than it ever was to him. His reputation for fearless driving and obsessive mechanical skill eventually reached William Durant, a businessman recently forced out of the company he had founded, General Motors. Durant saw something in Chevrolet that had nothing to do with racing trophies. He saw a name, European, elegant, easy to brand. In 1911, the two men founded the Chevrolet Motor Company together. Louis and his brother Arthur designed the vehicles. Durant handled the business. Their first car, the Classic 6, was a genuine engineering achievement. A luxury 6-cylinder vehicle priced at roughly $2,250, with an estimated top speed near 65 miles per hour. By most accounts, only a few hundred units left the factory in its first year. That number should have told both founders something important. Neither of them was reading it the same way. The story is usually told as a personal quarrel, a disagreement over a cigar, a wounded ego. But underneath the anecdote sits a genuine case of strategic misalignment, and it unfolded in 3 distinct ways. The first was a shift in market dynamics that the two founders read completely differently. Henry Ford's Model T was proving in real time that the mass market wanted an affordable, standardized car, not a hand-built luxury vehicle. Durant saw this shift clearly and wanted Chevrolet to chase volume. Louis, whose entire identity had been built on racing prestige and design excellence, wanted the opposite. Fewer cars, built better, sold to people who valued performance. Both men were responding rationally to the market. They simply disagreed about which market Chevrolet should serve. This same tension shows up today inside many Asian family enterprises, where a founder's personal reputation for craft or status can pull in one direction, while the next generation's growth ambitions pull in another. The second factor was an incentive structure that quietly favored one founder over the other. Durant controlled the company's capital allocation, and increasingly, its direction, while Louis's contribution, his name, his engineering, his racing reputation, carried no equivalent claim on long-term decision-making. When Durant restructured the company toward low-cost, high-volume production while Louis was traveling in Europe, it did not need to be framed as a hostile move. The incentive structure already guaranteed that capital, not craftsmanship, would set the final direction. The third factor was a governance gap that left Louis exposed. He had licensed his own name to a company in which he held no protected board authority. There was no charter, no reserved veto, no formal seat guaranteeing his voice in strategic decisions once his personal relationship with Durant soured. So when the disagreement escalated, resignation was not a negotiating tactic. It was Louis's only real option. In 1915, Louis sold his remaining stake in the company that bore his name. It was, on paper, a clean exit. In practice, it removed the one person whose reputation had made the brand credible in the first place, and left him with no ongoing claim to the fortune that name would eventually generate. What if the two founders had negotiated a dual brand structure early, a volume line, and a racing prestige line operating under the same company, the way other automakers would later learn to segment their markets. The capability existed. What was missing was a governance culture that made room for two competing visions instead of forcing a single winner to emerge. There was also a warning sign neither founder treated as one. The Classic Six's modest first-year volume. Read one way, it confirmed Durant's instinct that luxury alone would not sustain the company. Read another way, it could have prompted an earlier, calmer negotiation over direction before pride and a disputed cigar made that negotiation impossible. Early resource reallocation, paired with an ownership structure that protected Lewis's long-term stake, might have kept a Chevrolet at that boardroom table for decades, rather than for 4 short years. Louis Chevrolet spent his final working years as an assembly line mechanic for the company he had co-founded, and died in 1941 with little to his name. Decades later, that same company would sell more than 1 million vehicles in a single year, a record still cited today as one of the most remarkable in American automotive history. For today's Asian family enterprises and founder-led conglomerates, the lesson sits less in the sentiment and more in the structure. Governance frameworks that formally protect a founder's equity and decision rights, not just informal trust between partners, remain one of the clearest ways to prevent exactly this kind of quiet erosion. Leadership teams building fast growth companies would do well to design incentive structures that reward long-term resilience alongside expansion, so capital allocation decisions do not default to whichever partner controls the checkbook. And here is one practice any investor or executive can apply immediately. Whenever a company's name is inseparable from a founder's personal reputation, treat that as a governance risk to be formally addressed, not a relationship to be assumed. Louis Chevrolet gave his name to a company that outlived him by nearly a century. The boardroom seat he never secured is the reason his name outlived his fortune.